As the previous video discussed, with the advent of quantum mechanics, many cherished assumptions about our world have come crashing down. First, we can no longer rely upon a single existing reality as an explanation for why we all see the same thing. We had to replace our single universal movie theater with countless personal smartphones all streaming different shows. Second, we can no longer hope to understand reality as it really is, to get beyond the theatrical fourth wall. We had to toss out the ducky of unity with the bathwater. Third, we can no longer maintain that the universe works like a spring gear and escapement clock. We had to replace our clockwork with a black box atomic clock, the inner workings of which mystify and confound us. And finally, fourth, we cannot even be sure that things exist, that fundamental objects are real. We had to clean out all the stuff in our house and live an extreme minimized life. We had our metaphysical rug pulled out from under us over a century ago, and we are still stuck on the ground waiting for the ride to begin. This video, the second in a series of 4 focusing on the occurrence of events, will explore how we go about regaining our flight status. By the way, it was going to be 3 videos about events, but like in the Hunger Games, I am finding that I must split out the last installment into parts 3.1 and 3.2. I'm going for the big bucks. It will be a main thesis of the remaining 3 videos that physics is at a historical crux, a place in history where we are stuck and cannot push our way through. Most telling about the status in physics is the number of potential metaphysical solutions. It means that we don't have a solid answer to our existential question. In other words, we can't eliminate many of the possibilities, and correspondingly, we can't confirm one and only one. We are still in the guessing phase, where your guess is as good as mine. And authority, at least when it comes to the underlying metaphysics, counts for little. I will organize these different metaphysical solutions into 3 buckets: unrealism, hybrid realism, and realism, just to get a handle on them. Finally, we will construct a reality spectrum with infinite real on the one end and little r reality on the other, to better judge where the ideal solution should be. As before and going forward, it is the main thesis of these videos that the best place to be is smack dab in the middle of the spectrum, at least when it comes to physics. We want the best from both worlds. The undermining of our collective self-confidence happens infrequently, but it does happen, and will continue to happen in differing degrees. A small case in point, just 25 years ago, we believed that our solar system emerged out of a cloud of gas and dust to condense into the sun, planets, and belts we see today, all in stable, predictable, boring orbits, with occasional random collision thrown in to spice things up a bit. Under this model, our first heliocentric orrery model was good 300 years ago, and it will be good for 4 more eons, give or take 100 million years. Despite the original success of our orrery, there were some difficult things to explain. For example, Mars is far too small if we do a size progression from Mercury, Venus, Earth to Mars. Mars should be the biggest terrestrial kid on the block, given the amount of gas and dust available in its primordial orbit. And there are other difficult-to-explain facts, such as the alleged brief period of heavy bombardment that the terrestrial bodies encountered around 4 billion years ago, and that our satellite keeps a record of for all to see every full moon. However, these oddities were considered surmountable with a little elbow grease. At least something works like clockwork in our universe. Hold them horses. That all changed when we started to discover exoplanets. Is nothing sacred, free from change? Apparently not when it comes to the dictates of science. In 1985, Michael Mayor and Didier Queloz discovered the first exoplanet orbiting a sun-like star, 51 Pegasi, located within the Pegasus constellation. The exoplanet was first named technically 51 Pegasi b, and second, whimsically and traditionally, by Geoffrey Marcy, Bellerophon, who was a famous Greek hero known for defeating Chimera and taming Pegasus. Then officially a Dimidian, which is Latin for half, since Dimidian is about half the size of Jupiter. The public got involved in the Name Exoworlds contest for the third and final name. As an aside, Mayer and Queloz used the radial velocity method, the second most successful of about 10 exoplanet discovery methods, to peg Dimidian's existence, orbit, and size. The technique relies upon Dimidian wobbling its host star, and in us detecting the red or blue shift in spectrum it causes. The funny thing about Dimidian is that it had an orbital period of just 4 days. 4 days? I can't even finish a chocolate strawberry fudge cake in 4 days, let alone orbit a star. The static nebular hypothesis would need a major rework if we were to account for this anomaly. Well, Dimidian was only one case. It must be an exceptional oddity. Perhaps Dimidian was a rogue gas giant that formed in the stellar nursery, and 51 Pegasi captured it by pure chance. Our orrery was safe for the moment. Then things changed. By the year 2000, 30 exoplanets had been discovered, and 6 of them were similar to Dimidian, with orbital periods less than 10 days and masses in the ballpark of Jupiter. Jupiter's cousins like it hot, hence the term hot Jupiters. What was once an exception had become a trend. In response, one theory proposed that Jupiter-sized planets like to do-si-do with their host star. I will be suggesting the name Atticus in the next Name Exoworlds contest to name a hot Jupiter. Atticus is a genus of moth that Atticus Atlas belongs to. I also believe that Atticus derives from Attica, which refers to the surrounding region ancient Athens resided in. Or it could just be a coincidence, like visually overlapping galaxies that aren't actually merging. Under this theory, instead of static orbits, hot Jupiters form far away from their partner and migrate inward until they develop a close residence. It happens in as little as several million Earth years, which is a blink of an eye in terms of stellar system evolution. At least that is what some computer models have suggested. The jury is still out on whether Jupiter-like planets are like moths attracted to a light. It is mainly because there are 2 other competing models and not because hot Jupiters can be ignored. There is the in situ formation model, which proposes the early formation of a supermassive Earth close to its star that gobbles up all the gas and dust in potential inner orbits. Then there is a high eccentricity migration model, which proposes that a Jupiter-sized planet somehow develops an extreme oblong orbit, and that close flybys to its sun slowly nibble away at its elliptical orbit. Even though there is no final word on which model or combination of models is the definitive one, all 3 give a more chaotic model of early stellar system development. Our mechanical orrery may be a good model for a mature, relatively stable solar system, but it would have difficulty being used as a model for many, if not most, other stellar systems, or even our infant solar system. When we are presented with limited data, we tend to assume that the dataset represents the entire population. Sometimes we hit the target and sometimes we miss with this approach. At least I hope that the abiogenesis of life is a given in the Goldilocks range of other stellar systems. I hope that life on our planet is not an exception when the whole universe is considered. All we can do is continue to explore, wait and see. It is not always our fault. We do the best with what we have and make what we think are reasonable assumptions. It is a part of the finite human condition. We comfort ourselves with the refrain, "That is just the way it is." At some point, however, a growing data set may overrun the model, and we create new rules or invoke old rules in new ways, and then use the rules to formulate one or more potential models. We make our next best guess about what happened. A physical model, an encapsulation of a little bit of little r reality, nestled in an often taken for granted infinite unreal, is what comes crashing down when something is found to capsize the boat. The planetary example is a good case of how new facts employed an accepted physical model. It exchanges what is given and what is not. In other words, what needs explanation and what does not, of what belongs in the little r community and what belongs to the infinite unreal. In the orrery case, the fact that our Jupiter did not become hot now requires an explanation. If we accept the hot Jupiter model as the norm, some computer simulations suggest that Saturn's belated formation stabilized Jupiter's orbit and prevented Jupiter from becoming a full-blown bully. Despite Saturn's belated check, it is hypothesized that Jupiter's early inward spiral caused the late heavy bombardment. Jupiter was closing in on the asteroid belt and making a mess of things. However, a good father teaches his son to respect the personal surfing lanes of other deities. In addition, Jupiter's encroachment into the inner orbits can account for the relative runt size of Mars, although this picture is for the runt Phobos, who was the offspring of Eris, or as we call him, Mars. A short father begat a short son. Like begats like. Jupiter was like a Pac-Man eating primordial planet stuff before Mars formed. In effect, Saturn's formation tempered Jupiter's authoritarian tantrum and gave him a timeout. With the advent of more facts, we now have a better picture of what could have happened a long time ago in our solar system. Also, we have several good potential candidates. With a crowded field, the candidates can be prodded, questioned, and examined using different techniques. For example, we can start compiling data on other stellar systems to see how many are like our system, how many are like 51 Pegasi, and what are the characteristics of each. We can start searching for stellar systems like our own in different stages of evolution to categorize the different types of stellar evolution and their properties unique to each. We can build and run computer models or use analogies to see which theory makes sense. We can apply exclusionary rules like if the in situ formation model is the norm for hot Jupiter systems, then there should be a number of low-mass planets orbiting outside each hot Jupiter. Then throw hardships like the lack of resources or outdated equipment to perform these tasks into the mix. Eventually, despite the hurdles, one model or a yet unknown one will come out on top, and what we hope is a fair and good faith contest. The suppression of ideas is rarely a good idea. In a very few instances, however, we may have nothing to replace our broken toy with. We are faced with something that is unlike anything we have encountered before, and we don't know how to navigate through it. We become stuck in the middle of a question in our collective consciousness, like that Carly Rae Jepsen song. With its unanswered questions, modern physics has become our current Achilles heel. We don't have a clue about reality. And unlike the hot Jupiter model, which fills the gap between past and present, the gap in our understanding is based on scale. It is a discrepancy between micro and macro, and ultimately between objective reality and subjective experience. So how have we in general responded? Initially, we have blamed the messenger, little r reality, who we have lowered into the subjective abyss, abandoned, and refused to rescue. Consequently, the question of what was real has become irrelevant and unimportant to physics, and truth alone has taken center stage in our pursuit of knowledge. Still, the science body politic persevered in the face of that dogma. In our doubt, we are beginning to go back to the train hub to see where we went metaphysically off the rails. Confronted with this existential crisis, we have taken at least 3 metaphysical approaches to this carnival ride to allay our angst: unrealism, hybrid realism, and realism. For approach 1, unrealism, as already mentioned, we have gotten off the ride entirely, and likewise relegated little r reality to the sidelines. This is the route, for example, the purveyors of the Copenhagen Interpretation have taken. It is the most agnostic approach and the most popular when it comes to a show of hands, not because it is the most metaphysically complete and satisfying, but because it closes out the issues most scientists would rather not have to deal with. We are people of science, for goodness sake, not yarn spinners. With this approach, our broken model extends to the very roots of reality and metaphysics. It is like symbolic mathematics, which our imagination is incapable of picturing, even though we can abstractly play in that sandbox. Who needs reality when we have mathematical toys to play with? Correspondingly, these types of models do not rely upon any of the principles of reality covered in these videos, nor do they proclaim to. For example, mathematical objects such as a quantum field do not claim to equate to a physical object. Likewise, mathematical operations such as the evolution operator of the quantum wave function do not purport to be a real event. Even a mathematical equation such as the Schrödinger equation does not need to describe a causal relationship to be true. I am tempted to go into more detail about how the 3 principles of object reality and mathematics are 2 sides of the same Mobius strip, but that will have to wait until later. Still, the reason to ignore reality in the unrealist approach is clear and persuasive. Asking if the mathematical models are real, or if we should assign reality to parts of the model, does not gain us anything. It is a dead-end inquiry, so why bother? we can let the philosophers play with the mathematical metaphysics, which is more akin to fantasy anyways. Besides, the models match our macro world results perfectly, and no additional precision, the current measure of objective truth, will be gained if we assign realness to any part of our model. The only thing we have to give up in this exchange is any inroad into objective reality. That is one of the reasons the future is reduced to a fundamental probability and cannot be known. The mantra becomes, there is no there there. It is only smoke and mirrors put on display for our entertainment. Unfortunately, with this approach, we are left hanging. There is the admission that we don't have the slightest clue about what is happening behind the scenes, although there is still truth in the models we construct. However, that admission also includes the additional corollary that we can't, in theory, find out what is happening deep down below in the bowels of reality. So even if we wish to ask that question, that is grounds for being put in a professional timeout. Another new and improved version within this camp is Stephen Hawking's model-dependent realism. Even though he used realism in the label, I'm going to throw this into the unrealist bucket. It is an updated version of the Copenhagen Interpretation that takes into account string theory, supersymmetry, and multiverses, all combined into the M-theory jigsaw puzzle. When I first read Hawking's book, The Grand Design, I was quickly disappointed. Why? In his second paragraph, he said that philosophy is dead. I thought that rather cheeky, and so I skimmed the book, thinking it was just another popularization prone to sensationalism. However, upon a second reading, I gained a new respect for its cleverness, its mischievousness. It is a metaphysical cradle he places his M-theory multiverse in that gives it its beyond-this-world quality. I guess his metaphysical point of view can be summed up in the quote, "According to model-dependent realism, it is pointless to ask whether a model is real, only whether it agrees with observation." By the way, Hawking lumps mathematical and physical models together. And if it happens that more than one model can explain different aspects of the same phenomenon, then so be it. In this view, we no longer have to promote a single model over all other potential models. Some models are truer than others, and may be truer depending on when and where they are used. Anyways, models are just figments of our constructed reality. They have no existence outside our heads. Our mantra becomes, whatever works in here. Consequently, we can throw the dictate, one reality, one truth, down the chute. There is no more of this metaphysical nonsense, such as a search for absolute truth holding us back. Maybe the best we can do is combine multiple truths in our rucksack to take in the full expanse of our whole world. As in the orrery case, if there is more than one model that can explain hot Jupiters, and we can't use evidence and inference to eliminate all but one suspect, then we should be okay with that. Don't you see? Scientists are so much more pragmatic than philosophers, who are so rigid they would never leave their own house unless they could define what a door truly is. Personally, I don't believe bashing one discipline gets us anywhere, but some find it entertaining, especially if there's a little bit of truth in it. Like the Copenhagen Interpretation, model-dependent realism rightly denies the existence of big R reality, but also maintains that little r reality must be a bust since we have lost our ride. If we accept that conclusion, the only true job of the physicist then becomes the discovery of simulations, like the game of life, that happen to mimic what we observe and nothing more. The elegance and appeal of model-dependent realism is in its metaphysical reductionism, given the busyness of our current marketplace, and in the loosening the headlock that a single reality has put on us. In summation, Hawking's added the principle, there is only here, here. In both examples of unrealism, victory is declared by admitting defeat. We don't need to span the distance between reality and experience because we can't, or because we are the gap. Take your pick. So we have ended up in a surreal cafe. The cup is both full and empty at the same time, just like superposition in quantum mechanics. Speaking of coffee, it is time for my late morning mocha. If compromise is more your thing, you may find approach 2, hybrid realism, more appealing. In this approach, we attempt to reconceptualize the metaphysical world underlying our physical one, and to build our reality upon that atlas. An example of this approach can be found in loop quantum gravity theory, which Lee Smolin and Carlo Rovelli put forth in 1994. Loop quantum gravity theory has become very promising because it is able to quantize space in order to make it compatible with quantum mechanics. I would be negligent if I tried to construct an encapsulation of the theory here or anywhere. So instead, let's just take a look at the foundational key to the theory. To put it simply, loops, as the name implies, or more specifically, Planck scale gravitational field loops. From these loops, it is possible to build dynamic spaces that match general relativity, that generate gravity. Also fairly recently, the team has made additional advances. They have been able to incorporate into the theory an explanation of why black holes' entropy is correlated with its surface area, and why the cosmological constant contains much of the universe's positive energy. Loop quantum gravity seems to be on the cusp of a breakthrough, and it has become a popular field of study, rivaling string theory. At least that is what I hear. Not one to rest his fundament on laurels, Smolin has even actively been pursuing another agenda, the philosophical and methodological foundations to support the theory. He calls it temporal relationalism, which has its roots in the philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Even though some of the tenets of relationalism come from Leibniz, Smolin extends it with the addition of a temporal piece. One tenet of temporal relationalism is that objects in space are emergent and can be reduced to a fundamental time, to real events, and to the causal relationships between them. Time plus events and causal relationships become the sole building blocks for objective reality. I suppose one way to picture temporal relationalism is as a growing snowflake, although Smolin does not use that analogy. The crystal itself represents the frozen past. The boundary between ice and air represents the dynamic growing present, which he calls a thick present, and the freezing air represents the space in which the open future will grow. The thick present is made up of novel events that are causally connected with each other and immediately prior events, and that will determine the next layer in the ice, so to speak. Once an event becomes frozen and isolated from the present, it can no longer directly determine the future, although it had a hand in determining the adjacent present. Lee Smolin's temporal relationalism is refreshingly metaphysical, which he does dive into wholeheartedly. Brr, is it me or has it gotten cold in here? Still, Smolin's metaphysics, when applied to physics, is not treated or presented as absolute truth, but as the guiding light to illuminate the way. It can serve as a measuring stick for qualities that the best models should strive for. For example, one of Leibniz's principles that Smolin is big on is the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason holds that everything which is true for particular reasons. In addition, Leibniz proposed that everything that happens, namely events, happens for a reason. In both Leibniz's and Smolin's view, the world is not arbitrary. There is an explanation for its current state, no matter how weird. Everything has a cause which becomes the bulwark of truth. Consequently, in Smolin's extended view, we should look for phenomena that are not arbitrary, and we should propose hypotheses and theories that have the fewest arbitrary elements. For example, instead of settling for a world that is one of many possible ones set by chance or whim, we should be looking for how and why our universe is just so. All things being equal, we should first choose the most direct highway, the one constructed to get us where we want to go. Only after we have exhausted all possible ways straightforward should we choose random side streets as the underlying strategy to get us to our destination. These are words to live by. That is how progress is made. Using the Ori example, we should assume that reality, like our solar system, is active and causal, rather than static and arbitrary. There is a reason our solar system is the way it is. It is not a given. Underlying his entire scheme is a pillar of absolute existing time. It suspends each moment in reality and generates real events. Time, if I'm reading it right, becomes the bridge between reality and our experience of it. It allows a synthesis of the two. In Smolin's construction, time, which is an abstracted but real thing, grounds both experience and the loop quantum gravity model. Another example of a compromise approach is Cohl Furey's tact to derive the standard model from mathematical objects, namely 8-dimensional octonions. Talk about a cool name. I wonder if she's related to Nick Fury. Just to be PC, I made that small joke without any racial undertones. I could have just as well used the movie version of Nick Fury. Today's challenge is to figure out how. Like in the Smolin case, please don't ask me to explain Furey's beautiful bit of synchronicity. I have enough trouble with imaginary numbers, two-dimensional numbers based on the square root of -1, let alone the 8-dimensional octonions, which sound like a race of alien beings with 8 legs. What is interesting about Furey's approach is that she is able to complete the missing piece of using higher dimensional numbers to derive a particular physics foundational theory. It has already been shown that quantum mechanics is based on complex numbers, which include imaginary numbers and which are two-dimensional. Likewise, Einstein's relativity is based on quaternions, 4-dimensional numbers, and it is possible to derive the Lorentz transformations, the basis for special relativity, from quaternion systems. So that leaves a standard model. Furey uses octonions to mathematically derive the properties of particles in the standard model. It is pretty amazing stuff, almost magical. And I mean that in a self-amazed, how in the heck did they do that way? Abstract, high-dimensional numbers are the tie that binds reality and experience together. Who would have thunk that counting could knit together reality? And if you want to get further off the beaten path, there is the Quantum Gravity Research Group, which is attempting to build a unified theory from the projections of 8-dimensional crystalline shapes. They propose the emergence theory, which projects an 8-dimensional crystal onto a 4-dimensional quasi-crystal, then that quasi-crystal onto a 3-dimensional quasi-crystal. The 8-dimensional crystal has a tetrahedron as a fundamental building block, and all fundamental particles and forces become projections of this crystal. By the way, the tetrahedron in this scheme is a geometric shape composed of 4 equilateral triangles with sides equal to the Planck constant. Tantalizing, but it is still a brew in progress. They even have a slick YouTube video called What is Reality? The actress-writer Marion Kerr hosts, explaining the potential and the additional features of this model. Who said marketing is dead? Didn't Michael Hyatt, your next leadership mentor, say marketing is really just sharing your passion? In the end, according to this worldview, it all comes down to information, symbolism, and meaning. And if you dig deeper, Clea Irwin, the founder of the Quantum Gravity Research Group, pins it on a universal consciousness. Not a human consciousness, but a fundamental consciousness that can generate self-referential information and eventually human consciousness. I have probably spent too much time on this subject, and it may be easy to dismiss it as fringe panpsychism. However, who is to say at this point? They put it in oversimplified isms. Panpsychism does create a bridge that dualism cannot cross and that physicalism deems irrelevant. In this case, a fundamental higher dimensional geometric shape with a self-referential element bridges the gap. This gap is a quantum measurement problem in which we can't square what we observe with a phantom quantum underworld. Given an open, difficult question, today's crazy answer might be tomorrow's accepted theory. And even crazy may have bits of good in it. Sometimes madness is genius. Again, I'm not a huge fan of approaches that rely on a fundamental consciousness, but one can respect differing viewpoints and what they accomplish. In this scheme, an abstract, higher-dimensional geometric object forges a path from reality to experience. Going back to the big picture, with these 3 compromised theories, we stay in the observation area with the baby of the family, while we send our significant other and the older kid on the roller coaster. We are trying to pare down and combine the best from both worlds. There is an omission of the limits and illusions of human imagination, but we still cling to reality's security blanket, to an underlying objective world. There is still an out there, but it is not like our here. In other words, our perceptions do not do it justice. This hidden reality is way richer and more beautiful than our feeble slice of reality, but the hidden reality is still real, even if it is not touchy-feely concrete. It is a hybrid world that is based on abstract modeling. We can ask what is out there, but to answer that question, we must lift and elevate metaphysical, arithmetic, or geometric objects found residing in the infinite unreal. There is a caveat, however. The infinite unreal we pull these objects from must be divorced from experience. I suppose that by removing all subjective emergent elements from reality, the hope is that we will be left with objective fundamental reality. The following master chef test, then, for this approach becomes a proof in the pudding. If we can cook up the reality before us using one of these abstract ingredients, if our everyday human world can emerge from these abstractions, we have found the true fundamental nature of objective reality. The abstract becomes the new objective reality, even if we can only infer its properties. In this way, we can resolve the disparity between objective reality and human experience. It is a half-full, half-empty cup kind of outlook. Salud. Still not a satisfied customer? Well, there's always approach 3, the Megadeth Batmobile realist option to go all in. We can zoom into the microworld and construct a revolutionary physical model upon which to explain our current set of data points. Such steps have been taken relatively often and successfully in biology, the pioneer of this approach, with such discoveries as cells and DNA. Similarly, there have been some proposals made in physics for realist models of quantum mechanics with some fantastical properties, which I will hereby proclaim as following octorealism. Octorealism is my made-up term for minute realities beyond anything imagined before. It may make sense given that the octometer is the smallest unit of measure above the Planck length that the System Internationale recognizes. The prefix octo is based on the Greek word for 8, which English culture has simplified to the prefix oct, like for the word octagon. In terms of a octometer, the 8 expresses itself as 1,000 to the negative 8th power. It is about the diameter of a neutrino. And 8 just seems to have magical properties, given that some schemes rely upon 8 dimensions. As for myself, it is much more juvenile. I like the term octo because it sounds like the name of a Yoda cousin. Of course, the big unproven if of octorealism is that all the main elements of little r reality, in other words objects, events, and causality, apply to this mini-micro world. Even though I like to avoid isms, I had to create a formal tag for it. Under this metaphysics, little r reality, which I originally used to refer more to our everyday experience, becomes a reality independent of scale, size, or hierarchy. It is a reality based on physical existing objects, no matter what roles we give them, fundamental or emergent. In fact, from now on, I'm going to replace the term little r reality with a more general term, object reality. Even though the term emphasizes objects, events and causality are equally important to object reality. The term object-event-effect reality just doesn't trip off the tongue. Besides, I wanted to avoid the term objective reality, which connotes the additional metaphysical assumptions that reality is independent of and external to the mind. Some maintain that as their benchmark for reality, but I don't think we have to go that far in order to create physical models at the octo scale. Also, I wanted to avoid having to address issues like whether perception is required to make things real, or whether we can actually make meaningful statements about reality. We are not quite there yet, not even close. Remember, baby steps. Ultimately, it makes sense to replace the term little r reality since it was a BFF of big R reality, and we tossed that term a video back. Here is a quick diagram of how the old and new terms are related, if you are into that kind of thing, which I am. I am more of a picture kind of person. By way of a quick explanation, experience, which I once referred to as little r reality, and octo reality are both under the umbrella of object reality. I doubt I will use the term little r reality again, but in case I do, I just wanted to clear that up. Additionally, to forewarn myself, I have come up with the term octorealism to characterize the metaphysics of the micro. But that does not guarantee that the principles of experience do in fact carry down into the octo realm. As stated in the beginning of this video, there are a number of metaphysical models contending to be top dog. No amount of a priori squabbling will help us decide which position is correct. It would be like trying to argue over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It is pointless, dad pun intended. Fact-finding and experimentation should be the ultimate God arbiters. It may well turn out that objects cannot be said to exist in any meaningful way in the octo realm. That may occur even after trying to redefine what an object is. And I would be fine with that. Well, I might go out into the garage and throw a little tantrum, but that would be all. Regardless of any potential tantrum, it will be another thesis of these videos that in cataloging unexplained phenomena, some mega phenomena can only be explained by a octo-real model, similar to how cells are central to explaining life. I would place relativity, quantum mechanics, consciousness, and the unity of experience all in that same boat. and the boat that is searching for the water at the source in the quest for the wellspring of knowledge. Sorry, I got carried away. I was channeling the immortal Carl Sagan. In contrast, if we desire to answer such questions as why the chickens crossed the road, there is no need to rely upon such a Yocto model. Some phenomena can be explained with macro objects, objects that are higher up in the hierarchical reality chain. Likewise, I would maintain that Yocto reality does not need to explain everything, small and large, even in theory. For example, understanding how a car engine works does not explain traffic flow. Despite this, many want our laws to be universal, to span the distance in space and time between micro and macro, to explain all things. That may be one of the reasons quantum mechanics has frustrated us so. It has opened up a chasm between the micro and the macro. Maybe nature is trying to tell us something about our attempt to extend universality beyond its breaking point. Maybe we should be doubting the utility of extending universal laws into the deep. Perhaps the Yocto real model is exactly what is desperately needed in physics to mend the rift. It could be that a Yocto real model is a perfect antidote for what ails us. Hey, wait a doggone minute, you may say to yourself. If the laws of physics can't be universal, then why do the principles of object reality get to be? That is totally unsportsmanlike conduct. At this stage, I can only proffer a shot-in-the-dark guess as to why that may be the case. I can hear my Philosophy 101 professor clicking his tongue in the background as I cue up my putt. So here is the quick answer. It is okay to extend the universal within metaphysics, but not within physics. Even though fundamental laws in physics seem to fit the bill as metaphysical entities, as beyond reality, they truly are not. It is similar to the reason that the infinite unreal must be infinite, while object reality must be finite. It is what makes reality possible. Those dictums seem about 20 videos away, and I'm sorry to just throw them out there without further discussion. I paint myself into these corners, and rather than just stand there stuck, I adopt a hypothesis that unlocks a secret door and lets me walk into the next room, like one of those escape rooms where you have to figure out a puzzle or riddle to make it out. Tally-ho, here we go. Let's look at some other house painters who courageously entrap themselves in a corner, but who may have found a secret trapdoor out. One of the first to pursue a Yocto real model in fundamental physics was David Bohm, with his pilot wave theory. Although he never used the term Yocto real, that is on me. Bohm proposed that quantum behavior could be explained by combining an existing real Schrödinger's wave function paired with a classical particle, here recently replicated at the macroscale with water waves and an oil drop. It is like a surfer riding a big wave doing all sorts of rad tricks. Observers can see and detect the surfer, but not the wave, which accounts for quantum weirdness. Bohm was exiled both figuratively and personally to Brazil for his audacity, along with his principled stand against McCarthyism. Brazil is not as cold as Siberia, but it is as remote when it comes to physics. Under Bohm's model, both particle and probability wave are real. We just haven't figured out what kind of object the probability wave is yet. The next victim that history served up was Hugh Everett III. Everett proposed the relative state formulation as a solution to the measurement problem. It is better known as the many worlds interpretation, and it has evolved into what is called today the multiverse. It solved the conundrums that the wave function collapse introduced. It did so by characterizing the wave function collapse as an illusion. In its place was the creation of alternative universes that match each of the possible outcomes. Wherever a superposition is created, for example, a normal or catnip high sha-sha, mirror worlds are spawned, each one containing one of the unique states. The wave function collapse is not a problem because there is no wave function collapse. And we can't perceive the alternative worlds because our consciousness, another one of those wispy, ill-defined objects, are also duplicated and confined to a single universe. Too bad, wouldn't it be great if our consciousness could travel to parallel universes? Or maybe we can, we just don't know it yet. I'm poking fun, of course, but not at the theory, only my imagination. The interpretation garnered Everett his doctorate under the tutelage of John Wheeler. However, Everett's broad disciplinary interests, the lure of quick money in the military and industrial sector, and the ridicule the interpretation received, led Everett to drop his work. Everett self-exiled the idea and himself from fundamental physics. That model, however, has made a comeback. It is like a movie star's box office bomb when they first start out that later becomes a cult classic. In the multiverse model, spawn verses become real and tangible half-siblings, even if we can't visit them. Each verse is its own separate reality. Digging into the dirt physics has only recently become a valid career choice in physics, and advancing a mostly or an entirely octo-real model has finally become more acceptable. Just barely, though. For example, as mentioned in prior videos, Howard Wiseman and Michael Hall have been exploring a mostly physical model, the many interacting worlds model. It combines two realities, a Newtonian classical universe with a static multiverse. Instead of worlds propagating like the branches and sprouts on a tree, the many interacting worlds model keeps the number of worlds the same and they interact with a repelling force. We see a particle in our world, but its behavior depends on the interaction with the particle copies in the many other worlds. This theory with many static worlds is kind of like going to an out-of-business sale, at which many bargain hunters have glommed onto the same half-off premium tool chest, and they are all trying to push it toward their designated cashier station. The double-slit experiment outcome can be explained because all the particle copies in each of the many worlds are pushing against each other as they are forced to go through either one slit or the other. It is similar to Bohm's pilot wave theory, but further down the evolutionary road. I haven't been able to determine how consciousness fits into their scheme, or even if it is important to their scheme, despite my silly analogy, depending on many self-conscious bargain hunters. For this interacting world model, almost everything is real, the worlds, the particles, and their interactions. However, the causal agent, the driving force, is still a little bit rough and ill-defined around the edges. Yocto reality is definitely making a comeback from the brink of extinction. It may force us to redraw our perspective of what an object is, but that is the purpose of experience. It fills in our reality cans with content, with examples. By the way, in the next video, we will explore my physical model, at least its metaphysical foundation. The hope is to go all in, into the lion's mouth. All of the elements of object reality, objects, events, and causality will be made concrete. Oddly enough, only portions of the model will be Yocto. Some will be cosmological in scale. With a primarily Yocto reality approach, we can finally mend the rip between the micro and the macro. We get to lounge around in our old repaired comforting flannel shirt once again. In all three cases, Yocto reality is a thread that unites objective reality and experience together. In simple lingo, the realist approach reinstates the Minority Report proposal that there is a there, a here, and they are one and the same. It is a cup is full approach, and it is sure to elicit healthy skepticism, prejudiced dismissal, and even measured contempt. However, the intent is not to upset the apple cart, but rather to make a simple yet elegant apple tart given the apples handed to us. In Yocto realist schemes like these, most of the family, if not the whole, is getting on the ride come hell or high water. In this cursory metaphysical look at unrealism, hybrid realism, and Yocto realism, I examined a number of models. However, the list is far from complete and even short on the relevant cutting-edge work of the day. There are a lot more theories on the frontier with varying degrees of promise. Lee Smolin gives a good summary in his 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity. For example, I did not include string theory, which is not as clean bucket-wise, and which takes a more twister-like approach to metaphysics. String theory has 1 foot in the approach 1 unreal bucket, 1 foot in the approach 2 hybrid bucket, and a pinky in the approach 3 Yocto bucket. I say that because it is bending higher dimensional backgrounds to create real objects, more specifically vibrating strings, so it is kind of real. Why did I exclude string theory? Am I cherry-picking only test cases that prove my 3-bucket hypothesis? Am I trying to skew the data artificially? Nah, it is actually more desirable to make things messy when it comes to solving stuff. This is probably one of the reasons string theory is so appealing. It is more inclusive in who it invites to the party. Despite the 3 buckets presented here, unrealism, hybrid realism, and Yocto realism, it truly isn't so clear-cut. The 3-bucket model is just a springboard to a topic in the next video. In the next video, we will look at problem solving in a little more detail and how each of the 3 approaches emphasizes different combinations of inference engines, namely deduction, abduction, and induction. My oversimplification was just a way to organize an otherwise cluttered desk to make it conceptually manageable. That is another neat human mind trick to make a chaotic world sensible. If you want to stay messy and more realistic, a better way to characterize the range of approaches in physics is as a spectrum, with the infinite unreal at one endpoint and the object reality at the other. By way of pre-comment, this diagram is not intended to be complete, precise, or definitive. For example, there are many subdivisions and compatible isms of physicalism that were not included, such as realization physicalism and hard reductionism. Also, the focus is on physics and related isms, so such philosophies as idealism are not included in the spectrum. At least for this overview, there is no need to be exhaustive or all-encompassing. Likewise, a lot of time can be spent trying to produce a precise definition of the many isms, such as materialism, but precision is not needed for the general point. That being said, the spectrum goes a long way toward pigeonholing each ism. It magnifies the place where each practitioner zooms in to find truth. It also narrows the tools, facts, and models which a particular approach employs and defines as essential. For example, the Copenhagen Interpretation, which puts forth mathematical models as the best we can do, has slid almost into complete unreality, or toward the infinite unreal end of the spectrum. The almost exclusive focus on string theory over the last several decades seems to be a result of this shift. With this focus, math becomes royal, and it derives its sovereignty from the infinite unreal. At the opposite point of the spectrum, the object reality endpoint, we can go back in science history to one of the biggest twists in the road, with Newton's three laws of motion. Under this materialistic scheme, everything becomes matter, deterministic, and conservational. In the fourth and last video on events, we will look at how Newton's three laws subtly altered the three principles of object reality. At Newton's moment in history, materialism took over the throne from religion, and humans became insignificant motes of conscious dust, not necessary to reality. Both of these are examples of when physics overstepped its bounds, when it thinks that it can replace metaphysics, whether intentionally or not. It is when we get into trouble. It is when we create a trap for ourselves. We could fill in the reality spectrum with more detail, but the goal is not to be a taxonomist or a linguist at this point. Rather, I'm trying to be a sophist, to omit a marble-mouthed term. The term sophism is a combination of the root sophia, meaning knowledge or wisdom, and the root physis, meaning nature of all things. Sophism is the knowledge of all things, including knowledge of self. I just made the connection between the girls' names Sophia and philosophy, the love of knowledge. Yeah, I know, sometimes I'm a little slow on the uptake. Sophism is intended to encircle the place where metaphysics and physics intersect. It is a place where we go to understand the world and our place in it, our limitations as well as the potential. It is a place where metaphysics etches the outline in which physics must color, and where physics fills in the picture that metaphysics has created a framework for. There's no conceit in coming up with this term. If you want my honest opinion, I doubt the term will catch on. Mainly because the practitioners of sophism cannot lay claim to a superior form of intelligence gathering. It is not some new revolutionary discipline. Rather, it has been practiced for over 2,000 years, with varying degrees of success and with several missteps. It is often obscured or buried to avoid having to address inconvenient issues outside one's specialty. It is what Professor Smolin has been trying to bring to light, although his version of it is not based on full-blown object realism. I guess a more grounded catchphrase for the term sophism would be applied metaphysics, which typically relates to the social branches of philosophy, such as ethics. At least in our modern world, it will be a main tenet of sophism that metaphysics should be reinstated as a valid partner to physics, even if physics does all the heavy lifting. Some have called it metaphysical naturalism, but I'm looking for something more basic, less sophisticated, less evolved. Not that I'm an expert on the foundations of metaphysical naturalism. And yet sophism and metaphysical naturalism share some of the same goals, such as the unification of metaphysics and physics. However, my goals are not as encompassing. I'm just trying to clear a path in the metaphysical thicket so that a physical model can make progress. I'm just trying to open our inner eye to a new possibility. To clarify a potential misunderstanding, the ends of the reality spectrum do not denote metaphysics and physics, where the infinite unreal has to do with metaphysics and object reality has to do with physics. Rather, the reality spectrum itself belongs to sophism. Also, the three principles of object reality are sophistic. There is a corresponding sophism for the infinite unreal, but we haven't gotten there yet. Still, to fill in the taco with a little cheese, An attribute such as a shape is one sort of thing that resides in the infinite unreal. An object may be cubic, for instance, or it may be spherical. Or it may even be taco-shaped. And there are a lot more shapes where that came from, many with interesting characteristics. However, a particular shape, what makes a shape unique, is divorced from an object when it resides in the infinite unreal. It is a potential waiting to be made actual. It is floating in an unreal nihility, ready to be plucked out and merged with an object, to animate it, to give it life, to give it substance. I can see why metaphysics sometimes borders on the mystic. In practice, metaphysicians blend and mix these concepts from both the infinite unreal and object reality to make something unique and wonderful, even powerful. I don't mean to idolize philosophers. Many of their conclusions were based on fallacious yarns, the principles of experience. For example, many early thinkers had levitated metaphysics into the absolute realm, just like science has done with laws. Granted, the principles of object reality must be explored and expanded, but there is only empty truth there, intelligence without wisdom. However, it boggles the mind to consider how many insights were generated when human civilization was in its infancy. I find such edifices as Plato's allegory of the cave as impressive as the Parthenon. When I was much younger, I used to read Plato over and over, trying to make sense of it. That didn't make me a Plato scholar or even a philosopher, yet little nuggets of truth did filter into my brain, even if I wasn't aware of it. Along those lines, I would propose that the reality spectrum can be said to apply to metaphysics itself in its search for the color of reality. For example, the void, proposed by Parmenides, lines up with the infinite unreal, as noted in the last video. In contrast, the atomic theory from Democritus or the ever-changing river from Heraclitus could be associated with object reality, given their different emphasis on objects or events. Throughout history, each metaphysician emphasized different aspects of reality, depending on which end of the spectrum or principle they deem more real, essential, or true. Of course, these characterizations based on the reality spectrum are oversimplifications. Yet oversimplifications have their use. They can be a way for our understanding to get a foot in the door. They help us see where a metaphysician is coming from. Unfortunately, we usually only see the end result of mental gymnastics, and not the starting point and follow-on process that lead to a particular outcome. For example, as part of the process, every metaphysician has had to wrangle with trying to integrate the infinite unreal with object reality and vice versa. A case in point, the Achilles and tortoise race, one of Zeno's many paradoxes, results from this tension. In attempting to resolve this tension, each metaphysician tweaks and tunes their metaphysical model to try and account for such concepts as being, consciousness, truth, virtue, and naturally, reality. In addition, there are many other tensions that need squaring, such as space versus time, object versus event, reality versus appearance, and truth versus opinion, just to name a few. What happens when abstract thinkers do that, when they distill all of their complexity into a drop-sized sound shot? We end up with a remotion, an isolated axiom containing a ball bearing of hard truth that shatters our reality, that begs for resolution, and that may take the best minds decades, if not centuries, to figure out, to elucidate, and to evolve beyond. By the way, I stretch the meaning of remotion, which is slightly archaic, and which usually does not refer to a principle. I just like the word because it is based on the word remote, and is akin to removal. One way to think of a remotion is as a remote island of truth. Working with Parmenides again, who some consider the father of metaphysics, how are we to make sense of his proclamation, all is one? It is simple, profound, and incomprehensible all at the same time. I could parrot an analysis of the one, but that wouldn't answer the main thrust of my question. The answer lies partially in the reality spectrum and how it can be used as a tool to understand why a particular metaphysician makes the remotions they make. The reality spectrum is a model for what assumptions we concentrate on to resolve issues and questions. It is not a physical model for how our brain works, but rather a predictor of how certain questions will be answered. A good analogy would be the bass and treble control knobs on a car radio. I am cheap, so I never get the premium audio system. I don't have a mid-range knob, only a bass and treble one. To complete the analogy, the bass knob controls the object reality woofer, which rocks the low-frequency sound range. And the treble knob conducts the infinite unreal tweeter, which chirps the high-frequency sound range. Some like to set the bass knob to rattle their jaws, and others like to set the treble knob to purify the angelic high notes. Each metaphysician likes to tweak the knobs to find their own sweet spot. Back to Parmenides. He was the original tweeter, even though we only have fragments of his riff, his poem on nature. For him, the infinite unreal end of the spectrum was the, in capital letters, fundamental reality. None of those uncouth subwoofers. Still, the infinite unreal by itself could not explain reality. That is where the one comes in. It gives substance to reality. For Parmenides, there was a hard divide between what he called the one and the void. In simple terms, he equated the one with being and the void with non-being. In short, what is, and what is not. So far, so good. If we overlay his metaphysical landscape over my reality spectrum, we begin to see why he said what he said. In his scheme, the one takes on the positive properties of the infinite unreal, such as being in itself and unity that makes reality possible, that sets up reality as knowable. Thought and reality become one. As a consequence of this step, the void logically must acquire the negative properties of the infinite unreal, such as non-being and negation. Experience becomes an appearance of reality, at best a belief that each person has. Experience is a caused imperfect copy of reality. It is as if the infinite unreal has been split into two. The void forms the shell for our human reality, whereas the one is reality in itself, beyond experience, immersed in a sea of existence, to get metaphorical. As an analytical exercise for myself, I plotted out the elements that go into the bare-bones version of sophism, in order to compare it to the result Parmenides arrived at. Excruciating detail is not important here. There won't be a surprise test at the end of the video. It is more to show when the principles of reality come into play and how they can be used or misused. In brief, the first 5 rows just summarize some but not all the primary properties of the infinite unreal and object reality. As is often the case in sophism, negation is used to create opposing characteristics. For example, indivisible versus divisible. The last 3 rows are the basic elements that compose each form of reality, such as properties for the infinite unreal and objects for object reality. Definition and possession round out the relationship between elements in the infinite unreal and object reality. For instance, properties define objects and objects possess properties. Nothing earth-shattering so far. Although it might be interesting for a sophist or a pedant to dive deep here, I am just going to straightaway fill in Parmenides' portion. Sometimes I think that plotting out of metaphysical entities and properties is just as important as the actual philosophical arguments themselves. Like in physics, formalism, justifying a particular intuitive leap, is the necessary final step. But there is a lot of backwork, and it is this groundwork leading up to a certain worldview that may be more revealing. A detailed sophistic analysis of Parmenides is not the aim here, although it is interesting to note the major flip-flop, common to revolutionary ideas when it comes to reality. What was real became unreal, and what was unreal became reality. Of course, Parmenides did not stop there. He added a lot more metaphysics to justify his approach to finding knowledge, his theory of epistemology. A word of caution, I wouldn't quote me when it comes to the nitty-gritty about Parmenides. A lot of it wouldn't meet the muster of philosophical scholarship, and some of it is just straight-out guessing to fill in certain cubbyholes. And some of the boxes I didn't even want to hazard a guess. Still, with this breakdown, we can contextualize his position. For example, Parmenides may have been one of the first to put his faith in fundaments and decry things that are emergent. For him, the one is the fundamental reality from which object reality emerges. It is also possible to see why Parmenides turned his back on simple human perception. Like cattle, unthinking, a slave to the now, to quote a line from On Nature, to highlight what he thinks about basing knowledge on perception. Oddly, he is partially right. Experience can only teach us about correspondence, the joining of 2 events, with an ampersand in time. It takes pure thought to conjoin them logically and causally. If we take liberties with his metaphysics for a little fun, we could even interpret his theory as positing one of the first physics thought experiments. In effect, he was asking what happens when we dig down into the octo-realm. In this unsupported interpretation, objects and events disappear in smoke as we dissect them. For example, motion begins to disappear as we take shorter and shorter time intervals, as per one of Zeno's paradoxes. Also, under this scheme, causality becomes a big fat lie, a contradiction. Basically, something cannot come from nothing, which objects and events become as we take smaller and smaller pieces of them. The only thing left at such high magnification and precision is the one, a reality that exists independent of scale. So now we can see what Parmenides may have meant with his all-is-one remotion. He may have been saying that everything dissolves, then resolves into the one, with the emphasis on the words dissolve and resolve. In many ways, Parmenides was a precursor to modern fundamental physics, at least for the dissolve piece. And as we shall see in the next video, he may have also been right in a way he did not anticipate. Or maybe he did, in an intuitive sense. That is where a physical model comes in, for the resolve piece. To qualify my analysis, I don't mean to suggest that the reality spectrum or the sophism matrix will give us complete insight into Parmenides' philosophy, or any philosopher's metaphysics for that matter. Nor do I wish to denigrate follow-on interpretations of Parmenides, as if I could shortcut years of study with a simple cheat. Rather, the hope is to cast the basic concepts and principles from which both metaphysicians and scientists start. In effect, we are defining a baseline, the place that establishes the norm. It is like hot Jupiters becoming the new norm in planetology. Or to use the audio analogy, the baseline for reality is when both bass and treble are set back to their factory settings. To continue the audio analogy in order to make a final point, the control knobs are just a interface to the speakers. In between are a bunch of wires and circuits. As such, the reality spectrum can serve as an interface to the totality of concepts and principles that define the infinite unreal and object reality. The concepts and principles correspond metaphorically to the wires and circuits, the nuts and bolts, if you will. These elements allow us to have experience, to assume the three principles of experience in practice as well as thought. In other words, the principles allow us to appreciate a symphony, but they are not the symphony itself, which is composed of the notes of each instrument. Like the radio analogy, the reality spectrum is just an outline of the simplest case of reality, without a lot of psychological and metaphysical baggage. For example, it is a reality that is unaware of itself, and that is a neophyte when confronting reality. It is an infant who can identify something as an object but not classify it. If we bring up the sophism matrix again for Parmenides, you will notice that my sophism scheme does not cross the boundary into pure metaphysics, where philosophers and even some fundamental physicists are apt to go. Simplicity and not grandiosity are key. Yet, when we are ready to dig deeper into the principles, we will find that the principles are similar to the axioms for Euclidean geometry, but for experience itself. The truths at this juncture, such as the occurrence of events, are self-evident, just as the axiom, a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points is. However, it may well be that some future thinker will come up with a theoretically alternative form of reality, just as non-Euclidean and hyperdimensional geometries are possible. I can't even begin to imagine what that would be like, or what consciousness based on alternative forms of reality would have to contend with. Still, the baseline for reality could be the go for the gold standard for sophism, just as Euclidean geometry is for higher mathematics. In summary, we needed to find a baseline for reality in order to see if we have deviated from it, what the deviation buys us, and whether the deviation is valid and useful. This is not the most exciting endpoint, but it is a necessary step when I wish to select the best metaphysical soulmate for my physical model. I guess I'm old-fashioned. I liked arranged marriages when it comes to fundamental physics. Let's summarize and set up the next video. Our ride is still stalled because of mechanical issues, so we went to the hardware store mega sale in order to stock our toolbox. We are ready to begin repairs. Continuing the hardware analogy, the three main tools we acquired are 3 metaphysical buckets. The bounty in metaphysical interpretations, given the current state of fundamental physics, can typically fit into 3 buckets: unrealism, hybrid realism, and octorealism. A reality spectrum level. A reality spectrum creates a useful tool for classifying the metaphysics of any potential model, whether it be physical or mathematical. The reality spectrum places the infinite unreal at one endpoint and object reality at the other. A sophism matrix organizer. The sophism matrix can serve as a baseline to organize and evaluate all the properties and elements of a fundamental scheme supporting a model. It helps us place the model on the reality spectrum level. Even though I applied the reality spectrum primarily to fundamental physics and the sophism matrix to a small piece of pre-Socratic metaphysics, I would guess that they could apply to most human endeavors. For example, we could apply our new tools to psychology in its search to understand the human mind and its consciousness. No matter how tempting following that shiny object is, I must set limits on myself. Otherwise, I will never get to New Zealand, one of the items on my bucket list. In the next video, we will begin to look at the second principle of object reality, the occurrence of events, and how it is used in problem solving. I will also give a quick overview of my physical model, at least the metaphysical portion of it, and how it resolves two metaphysical conundrums facing physics today, namely fundamental particles and the unity of experience. The tools developed in this video will come in handy in evaluating my model for better or worse. Honesty should be the best policy, especially when confronting a daunting edifice. I don't know about you, but I'm more than ready for an intermission at this juncture, to allow me to process the storyline thus far, to ponder what craziness will ensue, and to savor the break. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to rest here a bit. You go ahead, I'll catch up. I got a side stitch from snacking on too much power food.